There's a quiet label people get that sounds harmless but carries an unfair amount of judgment. Bad texter? It's usually said casually, sometimes jokingly, but underneath it sits an assumption that you don't care enough, that you're inconsiderate, that you're lazy, avoidant, or emotionally unavailable. In a world where instant communication is treated as proof of connection, not responding quickly or at all gets interpreted as a character flaw. But being a bad texter is rarely about indifference. Psychologically, it's almost never that simple. In fact, people who struggle with texting are often deeply thoughtful, emotionally aware, and internally complex. Their difficulty isn't with communication itself. It's with the form, the pressure, and the psychological demands that texting quietly imposes. To understand why some people are bad texters, you have to stop treating texting as neutral. It isn't. Texting is a constant, low-level demand on attention, emotion, and availability. And not everyone's nervous system is built to handle that kind of ongoing accessibility. Texting collapses boundaries. It removes context, tone, and timing. A message can arrive at any moment, regardless of what you're doing, how you're feeling, or what state of mind you're in. And the moment it arrives, an expectation appears. To respond, to engage, to be present, to perform emotional availability on demand. For some people, that expectation feels light. For others, it feels heavy. People who are labeled bad texters are often people who experience communication as something that requires presence, intention, and energy. They don't experience messages as small interruptions. They experience them as open loops, unfinished conversations, emotional tasks waiting to be completed. And when too many of those loops accumulate, the system stalls. This is why many bad texters don't forget to respond. They remember constantly. The message sits in their mind like a background process, quietly draining energy. I should respond. I'll do it when I have more time. I want to answer properly. And then time passes, not because they don't care, but because care makes responding feel heavier, not lighter. Another misunderstood factor is emotional precision. Many people who struggle with texting are highly intentional with words. They don't like sending quick, shallow responses that don't reflect what they actually think or feel. They want to respond fully, thoughtfully, accurately. And that desire for precision turns a simple reply into a mentally demanding task. What looks like avoidance is often perfectionism mixed with emotional responsibility. Texting culture rewards speed, not depth. A quick "LOL," "sounds good," or emoji is often enough to maintain social rhythm. But for people who value depth, those responses can feel dishonest or incomplete. So they wait. They plan to respond later when they can do it right, and later keeps getting postponed. Another major reason people are bad texters is cognitive overload. Modern life already fragments attention relentlessly. Notifications, emails, tasks, responsibilities. Text messages add another layer of demand, often personal and emotional. For people who are already managing high internal load, one more request, even a friendly one, can push them into shutdown. This is especially common in people who are introverted, emotionally sensitive, or highly conscientious. They don't compartmentalize communication easily. Every message carries emotional weight. Even neutral texts require a shift in focus and emotional gear. And when energy is limited, something has to give. There is also an anxiety component that rarely gets acknowledged. For some people, texting triggers social anxiety. Not because they fear people, but because written communication removes immediate feedback. You can't see reactions. You can't adjust in real time. Tone can be misread. Silence can be misinterpreted. A message can be reread, analyzed, judged. For someone prone to overthinking, texting becomes a minefield. They reread what they wrote. They worry how it sounds. They imagine negative interpretations. They second-guess timing. And eventually, the safest option feels like delay or avoidance. Not because they don't care about the relationship, but because the medium amplifies uncertainty. Another important psychological factor is autonomy. Some people experience constant texting as a form of intrusion, even when it comes from people they like. Not because the sender is doing anything wrong, but because the expectation of constant availability conflicts with their need for mental independence. They may feel that texting creates a subtle obligation to be on all the time, to respond promptly, to explain delays, to justify silence. For people who value autonomy and internal space, that obligation feels suffocating, so they pull back. This doesn't mean they don't value connection. It means they value connection that has rhythm, not constant access. They prefer conversations that begin and end, not ones that linger indefinitely in their pocket. Another pattern among bad texters is emotional batching. They process emotions in chunks, not continuously. They prefer to check in deeply once in a while rather than maintain constant light contact. Texting culture favors the opposite, frequent, low-intensity interaction. That mismatch creates friction. You may notice that people who are bad texters are often excellent conversationalists in person. They listen deeply. They remember details. They show up fully. This contrast confuses others. How can you be so present in person but disappear over text? The answer is simple. Presence requires focus. Texting fragments it. There is also a boundary-related explanation. Many people who struggle with texting grew up in environments where boundaries were weak or inconsistent, where access to them wasn't respected, where they were expected to be emotionally available on demand. As adults, constant texting can unconsciously reactivate that dynamic. Ignoring messages becomes a way of reclaiming control. Not consciously, nervously. Another layer is that texting flattens emotional nuance. Complex feelings get reduced to lines on a screen. For people with rich internal worlds, this reduction feels unsatisfying. They don't want to compress themselves into bubbles. They'd rather wait and speak when they can be fully present. This is why many bad texters prefer voice notes, long messages, or in-person conversations. They're not avoiding communication. They're avoiding shallow communication. There's also a temporal mismatch. Texting exists in a strange time zone. It's asynchronous, but with synchronous expectations. You're technically allowed to respond later, but socially expected to respond now. That ambiguity creates stress for certain personalities. They don't know what the right timing is, so they freeze. Another important point is emotional honesty. Some people avoid texting because they don't want to lie with politeness. They don't want to say, "I'm good," when they're not. They don't want to perform cheerfulness when they're tired. So they delay responding until they can be honest. Honesty takes energy, and when energy is low, silence feels safer than half-truth. If you recognize yourself in this, it's important to hear this clearly. Being a bad texter does not mean you're bad at relationships. It means your nervous system, values, or communication style don't align with constant, low-context interaction. Staying connected to perspectives like this matters, because without understanding, people internalize unnecessary shame. And staying subscribed isn't about excuses. It's about replacing judgment with clarity. Another misunderstood reason people are bad at texting is that texting lacks closure. Conversations don't end cleanly. There's always the possibility of continuation. That open-endedness can feel mentally taxing. For people who like completion, texting feels like a door that's never fully closed. They postpone opening it. Texting also collapses emotional hierarchies. A trivial message and an emotionally heavy one arrive the same way. Same buzz, same screen, same demand. For people who regulate based on emotional priority, this flattening is overwhelming. They don't know which messages deserve immediate attention and which can wait. So everything waits. There is also an identity aspect. Some people don't experience themselves as digital first. Their sense of self is rooted in physical presence, embodied interaction, or internal reflection. Texting feels artificial, like acting through a mask. Over time, that dissonance leads to disengagement. They're not bad communicators. They're misaligned with the medium. Another subtle factor is that texting often becomes a place where emotional labor accumulates. Friends vent, family checks in, work overlaps with personal life. For people who are empathetic, this creates emotional saturation. Ignoring messages becomes the only way to prevent overload. This doesn't mean they don't care. It means they care too much to keep absorbing without recovery. People who are bad texters often need longer recovery periods between interactions, not just physically, but emotionally. Texting doesn't allow for recovery because it's constant and unpredictable. So the system creates distance. Silence becomes regulation. It's also worth noting that many bad texters are excellent writers when given time. They write deeply, thoughtfully, but texting doesn't allow that time. It demands immediacy, and immediacy is the enemy of reflection. So they wait, and then feel guilty. That guilt compounds the avoidance. It's been too long now. It would be awkward to reply. They'll think I ignored them. So the message stays unanswered, not because of indifference, but because shame freezes action. This cycle is extremely common. Understanding the psychology of bad texters reframes the entire narrative. It's not about disrespect. It's about overload, precision, autonomy, anxiety, and misalignment. It's about people whose internal world doesn't move at the speed of a messaging app. And once you see that, the label loses its sting. You're not bad at texting because you don't care. You're bad at texting because texting demands a version of communication that doesn't fit how you process, feel, and relate. Another layer that explains why some people are bad texters is how they experience emotional transitions. Texting requires rapid shifting between internal states. One moment you're focused, calm, or immersed in something. The next moment, you're expected to engage socially, emotionally, or relationally. For some nervous systems, that transition is effortless. For others, it's jarring. People who are labeled bad texters often need time to transition emotionally. They can't switch instantly from internal focus to external engagement without cost. That cost shows up as irritation, fatigue, or avoidance. So they delay responding until they feel more settled. The delay isn't neglect, it's regulation. This becomes especially clear when you notice how these same people behave in planned interactions. If you schedule a call, a meeting, or a long conversation in advance, they usually show up fully. They're attentive, engaged, present. The issue isn't communication, it's interruption. Texting is an interruption that pretends to be casual. Another psychological factor is the permanence of written words. Spoken conversation disappears. Text messages linger. They can be reread, screenshot, reinterpreted, taken out of context. For people who are careful with words, this permanence creates pressure. They don't want to say the wrong thing and have it exist forever, so they hesitate. That hesitation often looks like indifference from the outside, but internally, it's caution, precision, sometimes fear of misrepresentation. Especially for people who have been misunderstood in the past, texting feels risky. There is also a relational pattern that shows up frequently. Many bad texters are people who grew up managing other people's emotions. They were the listener, the stabilizer, the one who absorbed. Texting can quickly recreate that role. A message arrives, and suddenly you're holding someone else's mood, need, or expectation. If you've spent years being emotionally available on demand, silence becomes a boundary, not a punishment, not a game, a boundary. Another reason people disengage from texting is because it often lacks consent. Conversations begin without asking if the other person has capacity. A message arrives and assumes availability. For people who are highly attuned to consent and boundaries, this assumption feels intrusive, even when the content is benign. They don't want to reject the person. They want to reject the demand. But because that distinction is rarely understood, silence becomes the only option. This dynamic becomes even more complex in close relationships. Romantic partners, close friends, and family often expect faster responses because of intimacy. For someone who already struggles with texting, that expectation increases pressure. The more important the relationship, the harder it feels to respond wrong. So paradoxically, they may respond faster to acquaintances than to people they care deeply about. That confuses others and creates hurt feelings. But from the inside, it makes sense. Low-stakes interactions require less emotional precision. High-stakes ones require more care. And when care is high and capacity is low, delay happens. Another important aspect is that texting collapses emotional pacing. In real conversation, pauses are natural. Silence is shared. In texting, silence is interpreted. A pause becomes a message. And that interpretation creates anxiety on both sides. For people who are sensitive to how others perceive them, this makes texting emotionally loaded. Every delay feels like a statement, even when it's not meant to be. This is exhausting. There's also a difference in how people experience connection. Some people feel connected through frequency, others feel connected through depth. Texting culture prioritizes frequency, short check-ins, daily updates, constant presence. People who are bad texters often don't experience that as connection. They experience connection through shared experiences, long conversations, or meaningful exchanges. Frequent light contact doesn't register emotionally the same way, so they don't feel motivated to maintain it. This doesn't mean they don't value the relationship. It means they value it differently. Another factor is emotional honesty fatigue. Texting often asks for emotional summaries. How are you? What's up? These questions seem simple, but for introspective people, they're not. They don't want to lie. They don't want to overshare. They don't want to perform positivity. So they delay answering until they know what they actually feel. And sometimes, they never quite arrive at a clean answer. This makes texting feel like emotional homework. Work contexts add another layer. When personal and professional messages live in the same device, boundaries blur. A work notification and a friend's message trigger the same alert. The nervous system doesn't distinguish between them easily. For people sensitive to workload, this creates constant low-grade stress. Ignoring messages becomes a way to protect focus and prevent burnout. Again, this isn't laziness, it's self-preservation. Many people who are bad texters also have strong internal narratives. They live a lot inside their minds. Thoughts unfold slowly. Insights take time. Texting interrupts that internal flow. It pulls attention outward before ideas have finished forming. So they postpone responding until their inner process feels complete. Another misunderstood reason is that some people associate texting with conflict. Arguments, misunderstandings, passive-aggressive messages, or emotionally charged exchanges often happen over text because of its lack of nuance. If someone has experienced repeated conflict through texting, their body learns to associate messages with tension. Avoidance follows naturally. You might also notice that bad texters often prefer one medium strongly over others. They may hate texting but enjoy email, or dislike messaging apps but love long-form writing. This suggests the issue isn't communication avoidance, it's medium-specific stress. Texting is uniquely demanding because it combines immediacy, informality, emotional expectation, and permanence. That combination doesn't suit everyone. Another important point is that texting rarely matches natural conversational rhythm. Conversations stretch across hours or days, constantly restarting. There's no clear beginning or end. For people who need closure to reset emotionally, this is draining. They never feel done, so they avoid starting. There's also the issue of emotional prioritization. People who are bad texters often triage their energy instinctively. They may think, if I respond now, I'll be pulled into a conversation I don't have energy for. And because texting doesn't allow graceful exits, silence feels like the only way to maintain control. They're not avoiding people. They're avoiding being trapped. Over time, this pattern can create misunderstandings. Others may feel ignored, undervalued, or rejected. And the bad texter often feels guilty, but misunderstood. That guilt can deepen withdrawal. The longer the silence, the harder it feels to break it. This creates a painful loop. Understanding this psychology matters not just for self-compassion, but for relationships. When people stop interpreting delayed replies as lack of care, tension eases. And when bad texters understand their own patterns, they can communicate boundaries more clearly when they choose to. But clarity requires understanding first. If you're still listening, it's because this description doesn't feel theoretical. It feels personal. And staying connected to explanations like this matters because labels like bad texter often hide deeper truths about nervous systems, values, and emotional styles. Subscribing isn't about justifying silence, it's about understanding yourself instead of internalizing shame. People who are bad texters are often excellent at showing up when it really matters. They may not reply quickly, but they remember birthdays. They show up in crises. They have deep conversations when given space. Their care is not constant, but it is sincere. Constancy and sincerity are not the same. Modern communication confuses the two. Another reason texting is hard for some people is that it creates the illusion of intimacy without the substance. Frequent messages can feel close without actually being meaningful. For people who crave real intimacy, this feels hollow. They'd rather have one deep conversation than 100 shallow exchanges, so they disengage from the shallow. There's also a developmental aspect. Some people simply didn't grow up communicating this way. Their emotional language developed through face-to-face interaction. Texting feels foreign, artificial. Like a second language they never fully internalized. Expecting fluency ignores that difference. Finally, there's the simple truth that constant accessibility is unnatural. Humans were not designed to be reachable at all times. Some people adapt to that reality easily. Others don't. Those who don't are often labeled as deficient instead of different. But difference is not dysfunction. Understanding the psychology of people who are bad texters reframes the entire issue. It shifts the question from, why don't they respond, to, what does this medium demand that doesn't work for them? And once you ask that, the answer becomes clear. They're not careless. They're not rude. They're not emotionally unavailable. They're navigating a form of communication that clashes with how they think, feel, and regulate. You're not bad at texting because you don't care. You're bad at texting because you care differently. And once that's understood, the shame dissolves.